My parents secretly transferred my entire inheritance to my brother while I was studying abroad. The family vineyard, the estate, even my personal trust fund. They thought they'd erased me completely from the family legacy. What they didn't know was that my grandmother had set up a hidden account decades ago that would change everything. One email from a private Swiss bank was all it took to unravel their perfect plan and give me the power to reclaim what was always meant to be mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never expected to become the black sheep of the Devereux family. Growing up on our sprawling vineyard estate in Sonoma Valley, I was always the responsible one. The straight-A student who helped with harvest while my older brother Julian partied his way through college. My grandmother Eloise, who built the vineyard from nothing after immigrating from France in the 1950s, always told me I had her spirit. "The vines respond to your touch, Sophia," she'd say as we walked through the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon at dawn. "You understand patience. Julian only understands pleasure." When I was 16, grandmother took me to a hidden section of the vineyard, a small plot set apart from the rest by a stone wall. "These are our legacy vines," she explained, kneeling to touch the gnarled trunk of a plant that looked ancient compared to the others. Cuttings I brought from my family's vineyard in Bordeaux. They're over 100 years old, and they've survived 2 world wars, drought, and disease. Like the women in our family, they endure. She squeezed my hand firmly. "This section will be yours someday, your special project." For the next 8 years, I poured myself into that legacy plot. While studying viticulture at UC Davis, I'd drive home every weekend to tend those vines personally. When I graduated summa cum laude, I turned down prestigious offers from major wineries to work alongside my father and grandmother at Devereux estate vineyards. I developed a limited edition wine from those legacy grapes that won regional awards and got the attention of serious collectors. The Eloise Reserve became our most exclusive bottle, selling for $300 each and always selling, out within hours of release. Grandmother passed away when I was 26. At the reading of her will, I learned that she had left the legacy vineyard section specifically to me, along with a substantial trust that would vest on my 30th birthday. The main estate and business operations would go to my father, with the understanding that I would eventually take over as head vintner, while Julian, who had finally joined the business after years of pressure, would handle the marketing and sales side. The arrangement seemed perfect, until a prestigious wine institute in Bordeaux invited me to participate in their Master Vintner program. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to study with the best in the world and bring that knowledge back to elevate our family wines even further. My father encouraged me to go. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he said, helping me pack. "Take the year, learn everything you can, and come back to make Devereux even better." I left for France feeling secure in my place at the vineyard, and in my family. My father promised to look after my legacy vines personally. Julian seemed genuinely supportive, even throwing me a lavish going-away party. I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. 6 months into my program in France, I started noticing small inconsistencies. My father's weekly vineyard updates became vague, then sporadic, then stopped altogether. Emails about business decisions went unanswered. My calls increasingly went to voicemail. When I did reach my parents, the conversations felt rushed and surface level. When I asked specific questions about my legacy vines, they changed the subject. "It's probably nothing," my roommate Celeste assured me after I expressed concern. "They're just busy with harvest season." But harvest season came and went, and still the distance grew. Then I noticed something else. The Devereux estate website had been completely redesigned. The Our Story page that had always featured pictures of 3 generations, grandmother, my parents, and me working among the vines, now showed only photos of my father and Julian. My award-winning Eloise Reserve was no longer listed in our collection. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps they were planning a surprise relaunch with my return. Maybe they were redesigning the labels. I tried to focus on completing my program, but the knot of unease in my stomach grew tighter each day. It was an unusually warm April morning in Bordeaux when my world imploded. I was reviewing fermentation techniques in a sunlit classroom when my phone vibrated with a notification. Wine Spectator had just published their annual Vintners to Watch feature. I clicked the link, expecting to see coverage of some of my classmates' projects. Instead, the headline knocked the breath from my lungs. Devereux Estate announces leadership transition. Julian Devereux takes helm as chief vintner. My hands trembled so badly I could barely scroll through the article. There was my brother, standing proudly among my legacy vines, holding a bottle with a new label, Julian's Reserve, that had clearly replaced my Eloise Reserve. The article quoted my father. While we originally had different succession plans, Julian has shown exceptional talent and dedication over the past year. With Sophia building her own path in Europe, the family unanimously decided to consolidate leadership under Julian to maintain our focused vision. Building my own path in Europe? Unanimously decided? I felt physically ill. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an oversight. This was calculated. They had waited until I was an ocean away to completely rewrite my role in the family business, and apparently, the family itself. I immediately tried calling home. No answer from either parent or Julian. I sent urgent emails. No response. Finally, in desperation, I called Linda, our longtime tasting room manager who had known me since childhood. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice heavy with discomfort. "I wondered when you'd find out. They told everyone you'd decided to stay in France permanently, that you'd found other opportunities and weren't interested in coming back to the family business." "That's a lie," I said, my voice cracking. "Why would they say that?" Linda paused. "There've been a lot of changes, Sophia. Your brother has really taken charge. He convinced your father that the business needed a more traditional approach. Julian kept saying the wine industry respects male vintners more, that buyers take them more seriously. And then there was all that business with the trust." "What about the trust?" I demanded. "I shouldn't be the one telling you this," Linda hedged. "But they restructured things while you were gone. Julian has been renovating the main house, buying new equipment. Your father signed everything over to him a few months ago, the operational assets, the land, everything. They're even talking about selling off that small section of older vines to make room for a new tasting facility. My legacy vines, the ones my grandmother had entrusted to me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "I have to go," I told Linda abruptly, and hung up before she could hear me break down. I spent the next hour in a daze, pacing my small apartment, alternating between rage and disbelief. How could they do this? How could my father go back on his word, on grandmother's explicit wishes? And my brother, we'd had our differences, but this level of betrayal was unfathomable. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. The trust fund that grandmother had set up for me should have been accessible to check balances, even if I couldn't withdraw until my 30th birthday. The login failed. I tried again. Invalid credentials. I called the bank's customer service line. "I'm sorry, Ms. Devereux, but it appears your access to this account has been changed. We have on record that the trust was modified in January. The primary trustee, your father, made adjustments to the beneficiary arrangements." "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I can't provide specific details without proper authorization, but the account is no longer under your name. They had taken everything, not just my position at the vineyard or my legacy vines, but my financial security as well. The trust that grandmother had specifically created for me had been redirected to Julian. In 6 short months, while I was studying and working toward what I thought was our family's future, They had systematically erased me from that future, entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by textbooks about wine chemistry and vineyard management, and felt utterly hollow. Everything I had worked for, everything I had been promised, had been stripped away. The worst part wasn't even the material loss. It was the realization that my family had planned this, had lied to me, had waited until I was far away to reconstruct our family story without me in it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, scrolling through social media, torturing myself with photos of Julian standing proudly at industry events, my father beaming beside him. In one particularly painful image, Julian was literally standing on the stone wall surrounding my legacy vineyard, champagne in hand, with the caption, "Exciting changes coming to this underutilized section of the property. Watch this space. Diersak's new direction, Devereux legacy." By morning, I had moved beyond shock to a cold, clear anger. I wouldn't cry anymore. I wouldn't beg for explanations. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I would become the ghost that haunted their perfect narrative. I threw myself into finishing my program with renewed intensity. I worked harder than anyone in my cohort, stayed later in the lab, asked more questions, made more connections. If I couldn't go back to Devereux, I would make my own way. I stopped, trying to contact my family. Their silence told me everything I needed to know. 2 weeks before the end of my program, I received an email from an unfamiliar address, private@genevefiduciaire.ch. The subject line read simply, "Regarding account. CES2D3, urgent attention required." My first instinct was to delete it as spam, but something about the formality of the language made me hesitate. I opened it. "Dear Ms. Devereux, we are contacting you regarding a private account established in your name by Eloise Devereux in 2007. As per the instructions left by the account founder, you are to be notified of this account's existence 1 month before your 30th birthday, or in the event of specific triggering conditions monitored by our institution. Both criteria have now been met. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange verification of identity and activation procedures. This matter is of considerable financial significance." I stared at the screen, blood rushing in my ears. Grandmother had set up a secret account for me, outside of the family trust, outside of anything my father could touch? And what triggering conditions had been met? With trembling fingers, I dialed the international number listed in the signature. A polite, precise voice answered in French, switching to flawless English when I identified myself. "Ah, Ms. Devereux, we've been expecting your call. I am Monsieur Bertrand, Senior Account Manager. Before we proceed, I need to verify your identity." After a series of security questions, including details only I would know about my grandmother, Monsieur Bertrand's tone warmed slightly. "Excellent. I can confirm that you are the sole beneficiary of an account established by Madame Eloise Devereux 15 years ago. The account contains both liquid assets and documentation that Madame instructed be kept separate from the family's primary holdings." "What kind of documentation?" I asked, my mind racing. "Legal papers primarily, including what appears to be an alternate will and several proprietary agreements regarding certain vineyard holdings. There are also personal letters addressed to you." He paused. Madame Devereux was exceptionally thorough in her arrangements. She specified that this account should remain completely unknown to all parties except yourself, and only revealed under specific circumstances. "What circumstances?" Another pause. "Our institution maintains monitoring protocols as directed by clients with accounts of this nature. In this case, we were instructed to watch for significant changes to Devereux Estate Vineyard's operational structure or ownership that excluded you from leadership roles specified in the primary family trust." My grandmother had anticipated this. Somehow she had known that I might need protection from my own family. The account holds significant assets, Monsieur Bertrand continued, and the documentation may be of particular interest given recent developments at your family's estate. I would strongly recommend you come to Geneva in person to review everything as soon as possible. I closed my eyes, feeling something shift inside me. All these months, I'd felt powerless, erased, forgotten. But my grandmother, the woman who had built our family legacy from nothing, who had recognized something in me that my parents and brother never valued, she had created a safety net I never knew existed. I'll be there tomorrow, I said, a new resolve hardening in my voice. As I booked my train ticket to Geneva, I thought about those ancient legacy vines my grandmother had shown me all those years ago. The ones that had endured wars and drought and disease, the ones that grew stronger through hardship. My family thought they had cut me off completely. They thought they had replanted the future without me in it. What they didn't realize was that my roots went deeper than they knew. And now, armed with whatever my grandmother had left me, I was coming back to reclaim what was mine. I packed a single suitcase, my documentation, and the original keys to the estate that I'd kept as a sentimental touchstone during my time abroad. As the train sped toward Switzerland the next morning, I watched the French countryside blur past my window and felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't the end of my story with Devereux Estate. This was barely the beginning. My phone buzzed with a text from Julian, the first contact from my family in months. Heard you've been asking questions. Whatever you're planning, don't bother. Everything's been legally transferred. There's nothing left for you here. I didn't respond. Let them think I was defeated. Let them believe their plan had worked perfectly. Soon enough, they would discover just how wrong they were. The train crossed into Switzerland as the sun began to set. I watched the sky turn the same deep crimson as our Eloise reserve wine and made a silent promise to my grandmother. I would protect what she built. I would reclaim what was taken from me. And I would make them regret ever trying to write me out of the Devereux legacy. Geneva in early spring carried a pristine chill that cut through my light jacket as I walked from my hotel to the discreet address provided by Monsieur Bertrand. The private bank occupied a narrow limestone building wedged between two larger financial institutions. Its only identification, a small brass plaque with an engraved Genève fiduciaire beside the heavy oak door. Had I not been looking specifically for it, I might have walked past without noticing, which was precisely the point. Discretion was clearly their primary business model. Inside, the aesthetic was old-world European wealth, Persian rugs over, marble floors, mahogany paneling, and antique oil paintings of alpine landscapes. The reception area held just 2 leather chairs and a desk staffed by a woman who acknowledged me with a slight nod as I approached. No computers were visible anywhere. I gave my name and was immediately escorted through a door hidden in the wood paneling to Monsieur Bertrand's office. The man who rose to greet me was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the precise movements of someone who measured everything twice, from the exact depth of his bow to the careful alignment of the documents on his desk. Ms. Devereux, welcome. Please sit. He gestured to a chair positioned across from his immaculate desk. I trust your journey was comfortable? The pleasantries were brief. Once tea had been served and the door firmly closed, Monsieur Bertrand's demeanor shifted from polite to efficiently professional. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, he said, removing a key from his desk drawer. She opened this account shortly after her 75th birthday. She described it as insurance against ambitious men. That sounded exactly like grandmother. I felt a pang of grief and gratitude simultaneously. Bertrand unlocked a cabinet behind his desk and removed a polished wooden box with a brass latch. This contains everything your grandmother left in our care. The monetary assets, which are considerable, have already been transferred to a new account in your name. These, he said, placing the box carefully on the desk between us, "are the documents she felt you might one day need." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the box. It was heavier than it looked. "Take your time," Monsieur Bertrand said, rising. "This room is secure and private. I'll return in 1 hour unless you require my assistance sooner." With that, he left me alone with my grandmother's final gift. I lifted the latch and opened the lid. Inside were several neatly organized folders, each labeled in my grandmother's elegant handwriting: vineyard titles, proprietary cultivars, family trust amendments, and, for Sophia, personal. Beneath the folders lay a sealed envelope simply marked "Read First" in red ink. I broke the seal and unfolded 3 pages of heavy stationery. "My dearest Sophia, if you are reading this, then what I feared has come to pass. The vultures have begun, circling what we built. Your father was always too easily influenced by your brother's charm, and I've watched Julian's ambition grow unchecked for years. While a healthy drive is necessary in business, his has always struck me as something darker, not a desire to build, but to possess. I built Devereux from nothing but determination, and the cuttings I smuggled in my suitcase from France. I've worked too hard to see it destroyed by short-sighted greed or mismanagement. The legacy vines I showed you produce our finest wines not because of luck, but because they carry a century of resilience in their DNA. Like you, they don't yield to pressure easily. In this box, you'll find everything you need to challenge whatever they've done." The first folder contains the true titles to the Legacy Vineyard section. While the main estate is part of the family trust, I legally separated those 5 acres as a distinct property in 2005. The official deed shows you as co-owner, with me since your 21st birthday, with full ownership transferring to you upon my death. This arrangement was filed with the county, but kept separate from the family business documents. The second folder details the proprietary nature of the cultivars growing in that section. I registered them with the USDA as unique varietals under the designation Eloise Sophia cultivar. Any wines produced from those grapes without your authorization constitute intellectual property theft. The third folder contains amendments I made to the family trust after your brother's gambling debts came to light 3 years ago. Your father doesn't know about these changes because I worked with a separate attorney. These amendments require a supermajority of trustees to disinherit any named beneficiary, a protection I added after witnessing Julian's manipulations. The final folder is for you alone. It contains my journals, letters I never sent, and advice I hope might guide you through whatever storm has brought you to this box. Remember who you are, Sophia. You are not just my granddaughter. You are my successor in every way that matters. They may have taken what they think is power, but they cannot take your birthright or your knowledge. With all my love and confidence, Eloise P.S. The account contains $8 million. Use it wisely, but don't hesitate to use it fully if necessary. Sometimes the best defense is a forceful offense. I read the letter 3 times, tears sliding down my cheeks. $8 million. Legal ownership of the legacy vineyard. Proprietary rights to the grapes themselves. My grandmother hadn't just left me a safety net, she'd given me a fortress. With newfound focus, I opened the vineyard titles folder. Inside was exactly what she'd described. A deed showing me as the rightful owner of the 5-acre legacy vineyard. There were surveyor maps clearly marking the boundaries, documentation of the separate property tax filings for that parcel, and photographs of the distinctive stone wall markers that delineated the section from the rest of the estate. The proprietary cultivars folder contained detailed botanical classifications, genetic testing results, and official registration documents for the unique grape varietals my grandmother had brought from France. She hadn't simply imported French vines. She'd developed and registered a proprietary hybrid specifically adapted to Sonoma's terroir over decades of selective cultivation. According to the documentation, these Eloise Sophia vines were legally protected intellectual property, and I was the sole owner of that IP. I moved to the Family Trust Amendments folder with growing amazement at my grandmother's foresight. The legal language was complex, but the implications were clear. My father would have needed approval from at least 2/3 of the named trustees to remove me as a beneficiary. Given that the trustees included not only family members but also our longtime attorney and my grandmother's sister in France, there was no way he could have legally gathered enough votes to cut me out completely. But if that was true, how had they managed to transfer everything to Julian? I dug deeper into the documents and found my answer on page 17 of the amendment. While the original trust required trustee approval for changes to beneficiary status, a loophole allowed the primary trustee, my father, to temporarily reassign operational control of business entities held within the trust during any period when a named beneficiary is absent from daily operations for more than 6 consecutive months. My year in France. They had used my absence to trigger this clause, legally transferring operational control to Julian. It wasn't a permanent disinheritance. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a temporary reassignment. But my father and brother had clearly intended for it to become permanent, hence their efforts to keep me away indefinitely with their lies about me building my path in Europe. The final folder, for Sophia, personal, contained exactly what my grandmother had described. Journals documenting her concerns about Julian's character, copies of financial records showing the gambling debts he'd hidden from the family, and letters she'd written but never sent expressing her disappointment in my father's willingness to overlook Julian's flaws. I was still absorbing this wealth of information when Monsieur Bertrand returned precisely 1 hour after he'd left. "Have you reviewed everything?" he asked, resuming his seat. I nodded slowly. My grandmother was thorough. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Madame Eloise once told me she didn't trust anyone who didn't prepare for betrayal. She said it was a lesson she learned in her first decade of business. He folded his hands on the desk. "Now that you've seen the documents, what would you like to do next?" "I need to understand exactly what legal maneuvers my father and brother have executed," I said, finding clarity as I spoke. "And then I need a strategic assessment of how to counter them." Monsieur Bertrand nodded approvingly. As it happens, Genève, Fiduciaire maintains relationships with several discrete investigative firms and legal practices specializing in estate disputes. Your grandmother arranged for a retainer to cover such services should you ever need them. Of course she had. My brilliant, paranoid, prescient grandmother had thought of everything. I'll need full financial and legal audits of all Devereux holdings. "For the past year," I said, feeling more confident with each word. "I want to know every document that's been filed, every account that's been accessed, every asset that's been moved. And I'll need a record of all board meetings and operational decisions made during my absence." Monsieur Bertrand was already taking notes. "Consider it done. Our investigators are exceptionally thorough and entirely confidential." "I also need information on the current state of the legacy vineyard," I continued. "My brother mentioned plans to remove those vines. I need to know if that's already happening. We can have satellite imagery of the property within hours, and a ground-level assessment can be arranged discreetly." I nodded, processing this. "How quickly can your team assemble this information?" "Initial reports within 48 hours, comprehensive analysis within a week, and legal representation? I'll need someone who understands both California estate, law, and agricultural property rights." Monsieur Bertrand's expression remained neutral, but I detected a hint of approval in his eyes. "We have several options. I would recommend Martinez and Wolcott in San Francisco. Senior partner Elena Martinez specializes in viticultural estate disputes and has an impressive record against family disinheritance cases." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. "Please arrange a meeting as soon as possible. I'll stay in Geneva until we have the preliminary reports, then fly directly to San Francisco." As I walked back to my hotel, clutching the wooden box that contained my ammunition, I felt a strange sense of calm. The shock and betrayal still stung, but they were now overlaid with something else, a cold, clear purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming my inheritance anymore. It was about honoring my grandmother's legacy and vision for Devereux. Back in my hotel room, I spread the documents across the bed, creating a map of connections, a battle plan taking shape in my mind. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, the first direct communication I'd had from her in months. "Your program must be ending soon. We should talk about your plans. Call me when you can." So casual, so normal, as if they hadn't systematically cut me out of my own family, my own birthright. As if they expected me to come crawling back, grateful for whatever crumbs they might offer. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began my own research while waiting for the professional investigators to do theirs. The Devereux estate website now featured Julian prominently on every page. The Our Story section had been completely rewritten, reducing my grandmother's role to a quaint historical footnote and eliminating me entirely. Under Meet Our Team, Julian was listed as Chief Vintner and Head of Operations, with a bio claiming he had spearheaded the award-winning Eloise Reserve program from its inception. A blatant lie. I had created that wine. I had named it after my grandmother. I had selected the barrels, determined the aging process, designed the label. I dove deeper, checking wine industry publications and social media. Julian had been giving interviews, positioning himself as the visionary behind Devereux's new direction. In one particularly galling photo spread for a luxury lifestyle magazine, he was pictured standing in my legacy vineyard, describing plans to replace the outdated low-yield vines with modern, efficient cultivars that would bring Devereux into the 21st century. The ignorance of it made my blood boil. Those outdated vines produced our most distinctive wines precisely because of their age and genetic uniqueness. Replacing them with commercial cultivars would destroy what made Devereux special. It wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was viticultural vandalism. I made notes of every false claim, every misrepresentation, every plan that contradicted sound winemaking principles. Julian might have charm and ambition, but his knowledge of viticulture was superficial at best. He was already making fundamental mistakes that would damage the vineyard's reputation for years to come. 2 days later, Monsieur Bertrand's investigative team delivered their preliminary report. It was worse than I'd imagined. My father had indeed used the temporary reassignment clause to transfer operational control to Julian, but they had gone further, creating a separate LLC that now technically managed the estate, effectively placing the assets one step removed from the trust's restrictions. They had drafted documents showing I had voluntarily relinquished my position, documents with a forged signature that wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny. Most alarmingly, satellite imagery showed construction equipment at the edge of the legacy vineyard. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated. I called the number M. Bertrand had provided for Elena Martinez and was connected immediately. "Ms. Devereux," she answered, her voice sharp and focused. "I've reviewed the preliminary findings. We need to move quickly if you want to prevent irreversible damage to those vines." "What do you recommend?" I asked. "A two-pronged approach," she said without hesitation. "First, an emergency injunction to halt any alterations to the legacy vineyard based on your clear deed ownership. Second, a comprehensive challenge to the trust manipulations, focusing on the forged relinquishment documents and violation of the supermajority requirement for beneficiary changes. How soon can we file?" "I've already prepared the injunction paperwork. It can be filed tomorrow morning if you approve. The broader case will take more preparation, but we can have it ready within 10 days. I thought of Julian standing on the stone wall of my vineyard, champagne in hand, planning to tear out vines that had survived 2 world wars. I thought of my father signing away my birthright with a dismissive stroke of his pen. I thought of my mother's casual text, as if nothing had happened. "File everything," I said, And tell them I'm coming home. The Fairmont San Francisco's penthouse suite offered a panoramic view of the bay that I barely noticed as Elena Martinez spread documents across the dining table that had become our war room. 3 days had passed since my arrival from Geneva, and in that time, Elena had assembled what she called her vineyard rescue team. 2 junior attorneys specializing in agricultural property law, a forensic accountant with experience in family business disputes, and a viticulture expert who could testify to the irreplaceable value of my legacy vines. The emergency injunction was granted this morning, Elena announced, sliding a legal document across the table. Construction at the legacy vineyard has been halted, effective immediately. Judge Watkins was particularly concerned about the potential destruction of historically significant cultivars. Relief washed through me. So they can't touch the vines. While we fight the larger battle, correct, the injunction buys us time, but it's only the first step. Elena tapped a folder labeled Trust Violations. We need to be strategic about how we proceed. Your family will be lawyering up as we speak. The forensic accountant, a methodical woman named Vanessa, adjusted her glasses. I've completed the initial financial analysis. The picture isn't pretty. She opened her laptop, turning it to show us a complex flowchart. Your father and brother have been systematically moving assets through a series of LLCs. They've created what amounts to a shell game, making it difficult to track exactly what belongs to whom. Can they do that legally? I asked. Not with assets held in trust under the conditions your grandmother established, Vanessa replied. But they're exploiting gray areas, moving quickly, and clearly hoping no one would challenge them. At least, not someone with the resources to unravel what they've done. Elena's expression was grim. The good news is that their haste has led to mistakes. The forged signatures on your so-called voluntary relinquishment wouldn't stand up to expert analysis. And we've confirmed that they never secured the required trustee votes for the benefit changes. So we can prove fraud? I leaned forward. We can strongly suggest impropriety, Elena clarified. But courtroom battles between family members can get ugly and unpredictable, and they drag on for years. She paused meaningfully. I think we need to consider whether a direct legal confrontation is actually your best strategy. I frowned. What's the alternative? Let them keep what they stole? Not at all. Elena slid another document toward me, a satellite image of Devereux, a state with the legacy vineyard section highlighted in red. You have absolute legal title to this land. The proprietary cultivars are registered in your name. Your grandmother's $8 million gift provides you with significant financial leverage. I'm suggesting we use these advantages strategically, rather than simply filing a lawsuit that broadcasts your family's dirty laundry to the world. I considered this. A public legal battle would damage the Devereux brand, potentially destroying the very thing I was fighting to reclaim. What do you propose instead? Asymmetrical warfare, Elena said with a small smile. You have assets and information they don't know about. Let's use the element of surprise. Over the next 2 hours, we crafted a multi-layered strategy that felt more like a chess game than a legal proceeding. The first phase would involve gathering additional evidence while maintaining the element of surprise. The second would be a strategic appearance at Devereux Estate, not as a supplicant returning home, but as a property owner conducting an inspection. The third phase would be a carefully orchestrated negotiation from a position of strength. While Elena's team handled the legal preparations, I had my own role to play. I needed to reconnect with allies still working at the vineyard without alerting my family to my return. I needed to assess the current state of both the business and the vines. And I needed to appear completely unruffled when I finally confronted my family. Remember, Elena cautioned as our meeting concluded, they believe you're still in Europe, possibly unaware of the full extent of what they've done. That misconception is one of your strongest advantages. With the strategy session complete, I moved into the operational phase of our plan. My first call was to Linda, the tasting room manager who had initially warned me about what was happening. "Sophia?" she whispered when she answered. "Are you back in the States?" "I am, but I need your discretion," I replied. "What's the current situation at Devereux?" Linda's voice dropped further. "It's chaos. Julian's been making changes left and right. New labels, new blends, new marketing. Most of the staff who worked closely with you have been let go. He's brought in consultants from Napa who know nothing about our terroir." She paused. "And there's been trouble with vendors. Julian's late paying bills, and some suppliers are threatening to cut us off." "What about my legacy vines?" I asked, dreading the answer. "He had equipment out there yesterday, ready to start clearing, but then some legal papers arrived and everything stopped. Your father and brother have been locked in the office making calls ever since." I smiled grimly. The injunction had hit its mark. "Linda, I need a favor. The fall release schedule. Do you have access to it?" "I can get it. Why?" "I need to know what they're planning to bottle, especially anything using grapes from the Legacy Vineyard section." "I'll send it tonight," she promised. "Sophia, are you fighting back?" "I am. And I could use allies who remember what Devereux is supposed to stand for." By evening, Linda had come through with the information I needed. Julian was planning to release a new premium wine called Chairman's Reserve, using my legacy grapes, a wine that would sell for $500 a bottle, more than our most expensive offering had ever cost. The marketing materials claimed it represented a bold new direction for Devereux. What Julian didn't know, couldn't know, was that using those grapes without my authorization constituted intellectual property theft. The proprietary cultivars were legally registered under my name. Any wine produced from them without my consent could not be legally sold. The next day, I met with Dr. Raymond Chen, a renowned viticulturist who had agreed to serve as our expert witness if needed. We reviewed satellite imagery of the Legacy Vineyard together, and he confirmed what I had feared. These vines aren't just old, Ms. Devereux. They're genuine pre-prohibition stock, with genetic markers that have become exceedingly rare after the phylloxera devastation of the 1980s. Replacing them with modern commercial cultivars, as your brother apparently intends, would be— He searched for the right words, like replacing a Stradivarius with a mass-produced violin from a factory. "Can you document their value? Not just financially, but historically and botanically?" "Absolutely." Dr. Chen nodded emphatically. "These vines represent a living agricultural museum. There are fewer than a dozen known vineyards in California with authenticated pre-prohibition rootstock. The value is essentially incalculable from a heritage perspective." Armed with his assessment, I authorized Elena to file for additional protections based on the historical significance of the vines. If Julian wanted to fight, he would find himself battling not just me, but agricultural preservation societies, historical conservation groups, and state agencies tasked with protecting California's viticultural heritage. On day 5 of our campaign, I received a text from my father. "We need to talk. Things have gotten complicated with the Legacy Vineyard section. Call me." I showed Elena the message, and she smiled tightly. "They're feeling the pressure. They know something's happening, but they don't yet realize you're behind it. This is good timing for the next phase." That next phase involved a calculated risk. I would need to access the Devereux business records directly. While we had gathered substantial evidence from public filings and financial disclosures, we needed internal documents to complete our case, board minutes, operational decisions, and most importantly, the paper trail showing exactly how my voluntary relinquishment had been fabricated. "You still have keys to the main house and office?" Elena asked. I nodded, pulling out the old brass keyring I'd kept during my time in France. "The security codes might have been changed, but the physical locks are likely the same." "Good. California law is clear. As a beneficial owner of the trust and a named officer of the company who has never been legally removed, you have every right to access those records. She handed me a formal-looking document. This is a declaration, asserting your continued legal interest in the company. If anyone tries to prevent you from accessing the property or records, present this. The plan was set for the following morning. I would arrive at Devereux estate early, before business hours, accompanied by one of Elena's junior attorneys, who would video document everything as a precaution. We would access the office, gather the necessary records, and be gone before my lao. Family typically arrived. That night, I could barely sleep. Anxiety and anticipation kept my mind racing. I found myself staring at a photo on my phone, the last picture taken of my grandmother and me together in the legacy vineyard, both of us kneeling beside a gnarled vine, her weathered hand covering mine as she taught me to feel for the subtle signs that the grapes were ready for harvest. Trust the vine, not the calendar, she had said that day. The vine knows when it's time. Now, I hoped I would know when the moment was right to make my final move. Dawn was just breaking over the hills as my rental car crested the long driveway leading to Devereux estate. The morning fog hung low over the vineyards, shrouding the familiar landscape in a dreamlike haze. The enormous Victorian house that served as both family home and business headquarters stood silent, no lights visible through its many windows. Adam, Elena's associate, checked his camera equipment as we parked. Remember, we're here for documents only. If anyone confronts us, remain calm, present the declaration, and continue with our task. If they become hostile or attempt to prevent our legal access, we leave immediately and file additional charges. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my feet with a sound that transported me instantly back to childhood. How many mornings had I walked this same path, ready for a day among the vines? How many harvests had I celebrated on the wide porch that wrapped around the house? This place was in my blood, as surely as it was in my name. My key still fit the side door lock, turning smoothly as if I'd used it yesterday instead of nearly a year ago. The familiar scent of lemon oil and old wood enveloped me as we stepped into the quiet hallway. Nothing had changed in the main house. The same antique console table held a crystal bowl that had always been filled with seasonal flowers from the garden. Now it sat empty, a thin layer of dust visible on its surface. We moved silently toward the back of the house, where double doors opened into the business office. Here, my key hesitated briefly before the lock yielded. Inside, the changes were immediately apparent. The warm traditional decor had been replaced with sleek modern furniture. The wall that had displayed family photos and historic vineyard images now held abstract art in aggressive red and black. Julian's influence was stamped everywhere. "Start with the filing cabinets," I whispered to Adam, moving toward the computer at the main desk. "I'll check digital records." As Adam documented and copied key documents, I logged into the Devereux system. My old password still worked, an oversight that spoke to the haphazard nature of their takeover. What I found made my blood run cold. Sales were down 30% year over year. Costs had skyrocketed with Julian's new equipment purchases and consultant fees. 3 of our most long-standing distributor contracts had been terminated. And most alarmingly, there was an email thread discussing the potential sale of 49% of Devereux to a large beverage conglomerate known for buying out family wineries and turning them into mass-market labels. They weren't just stealing my inheritance, they were running the business into the ground. I was downloading the financial records when headlights swept across the window. A car was coming up the drive, hours earlier than expected. I frantically finished the download while Adam quickly packed the documents we'd gathered. "Time to go," he said urgently, but it was too late. The front door opened, and footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Who's in there?" My father's voice, tense and angry. I stood, straightening my shoulders, suddenly calm in the face of confrontation. The moment had arrived sooner than planned. but as grandmother would say, the vine knows when it's time. The office door swung open, and my father stood, frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock. "Hello, Dad," I said evenly. "We need to talk about what you and Julian have done to Devereux, and what I'm going to do about it." My father aged 10 years in the seconds he stood staring at me. The confident, commanding presence I remembered had diminished somehow. Shoulders slightly stooped, hair grayer than when I'd left, deep lines etched around his mouth. For a moment, I glimpsed something like fear in his eyes before he masked it with indignation. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, gaze darting between me and Adam, who continued calmly documenting everything with his camera. "And who is this? You can't just break in." "I used my key," I interrupted, my voice steadier than I expected. "And this is Adam Chen, legal associate with Martinez and Wolcott. He's here as a witness." I lifted the folder containing Elena's declaration. As a beneficial owner of the Devereux Family Trust and a named officer of Devereux Estate Vineyards who has never been legally removed from my position, I have every right to access these premises and review company records. I could see him processing this, recalculating. The script he'd been following, where I remained ignorant in Europe while they dismantled my place in the family business, had just been shredded. "Sophia," he switched tactics, his tone softening. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming home? This cloak and dagger approach isn't necessary. We're family." "Are we?" I kept my voice level. Families don't forge signatures on relinquishment documents. They don't reroute someone's mail to hide legal notices. They don't erase a person's entire history with the business and pretend she never existed. His face flushed. "That's not... We didn't..." He stopped, composing himself. "There have been misunderstandings, certainly, but coming in here with lawyers and cameras, this isn't how we handle things." "It is now." I gestured to the documents Adam had collected. "We have copies of everything. The forged relinquishment papers, the unauthorized amendments to the trust, the financial records showing how badly the business is performing under Julian's leadership, and the emails discussing selling nearly half of Devereux to Westland Beverage Group." At the mention of Westland, my father's expression shifted. I'd struck a nerve. "You don't understand the financial realities," he said, moving toward his desk. "Julian has a vision for modernization that requires significant investment. The Westland partnership is still just a discussion, a potential solution to cash flow issues. Cash flow issues that didn't exist when I was running operations," I countered. "The vineyard was profitable every quarter under my management. We had 3 international distributors lined up for expansion. What happened to those contracts?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Julian felt they weren't aligned with our new direction." "And what direction is that? Mass-producing mediocre wine for? Airport duty-free shops? Because that's what happens when Westland takes over family vineyards. Look at what they did to Harrington Estates or Creston Cellars." My father sat heavily in his chair. "We needed to make changes, Sophia. The market is evolving." "Stop." Placed both hands on his desk, leaning forward. "This isn't about market evolution. This is about Julian convincing you to hand him everything, including what was rightfully mine, and you let him do it." The accusation hung in the air between us. Outside, a car door slammed. Moments later, Julian's voice called from the hallway. "Dad? Your car's here early. Everything okay?" Then he was in the doorway, dressed in designer casual wear that looked absurdly out of place for a morning at a working vineyard. The shock on his face when he saw me was almost comical. "What the hell?" he sputtered. "You're supposed to be in France." Surprise. I straightened, turning to face my brother fully. "I came home to check on my legacy vineyard. Imagine my shock when I discovered you were planning to rip out 100-year-old vines to build a tasting pavilion." Julian recovered quickly, falling into the smooth, condescending tone he'd always used when he thought he knew better than me. "Those old vines are barely producing. The land is more valuable as a hospitality venue. It's just business, Soph. It's intellectual property theft, I replied calmly. Those old vines are legally registered proprietary cultivars. The Eloise Sophia varietal belongs to me, not to Devereux Estates, not to the family trust, and certainly not to you. His expression faltered. What are you talking about? I nodded to Adam, who handed me the documentation from my grandmother's box. These are the USDA registration certificates showing that I am the sole owner of the proprietary grape varietals growing in the legacy vineyard. Any wine produced from those grapes without my authorization constitutes theft of intellectual property. I paused. Including the 10,000 bottles of Chairman's Reserve you're planning to release next month. Julian paled visibly. Dad? What is she talking about? My father was staring at the documents, recognition dawning. Eloise registered the vines separately? When did she do this? Years ago, I said. She always believed in backup plans. Speaking of which, I pulled out the deed to the legacy vineyard section. This is the property deed showing that the 5-acre legacy section is titled separately from the main estate, with ownership transferred to me upon grandmother's death. It's not part of the family trust and never was. Which means your construction plans aren't just unwise. They're illegal trespassing on my property. The silence that followed was broken by the buzzing of Julian's phone. He glanced at it, then back at me with narrowed eyes. What do you want? Money? Because if you think you can just waltz back in here and take over after abandoning the business for a year, I didn't abandon anything, I cut him off. I went to study with the specific intention of bringing new expertise back to Devereux. You and Dad used my absence to stage a coup, systematically erasing me from the company I helped build. My father stood slowly. Sophia, please. There's no need for this hostility. We can discuss a settlement, some financial arrangement that I'm not interested in being bought off. I gathered the documents, sliding them back into my folder. I've seen the financial reports. Sales are down 30% year over year. 3 major distributors have terminated their contracts. You've taken on excessive debt for equipment purchases that aren't yielding results. And now you're considering selling to Westland out of desperation. Julian's face flushed with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. I've modernized operations, streamlined production. You've decimated what made Devereux special, I interrupted. Our reputation was built on artisanal quality and heritage techniques. You're turning it into just another corporate label. That's enough. My father's voice cracked with authority. Both of you. This isn't productive. He turned to me. Clearly, we need to reassess the situation. What do you propose? Before I could answer, the front door opened again, and my mother's voice called out. Ezekiel, Julian, are you here? There's a strange car in the drive. She appeared in the doorway, freezing when she saw me. Sophia? Her hand flew to her throat, a gesture so theatrical it would have been comical in any other circumstance. What are you doing here? Hello, Mother, I said coolly. I was just explaining to Dad and Julian that they've illegally appropriated my property and intellectual assets. Would you care to join the conversation? Perhaps explain why you redirected my mail to hide legal notices from me. My mother's eyes widened, darting to my father as if seeking a script. I don't know what you're talking about. We thought you were staying in France. Your father was just trying to keep the business running while you were away. By forging my signature on relinquishment documents, by erasing me from the company history, by planning to sell out to Westland? I shook my head. That's not keeping things running. That's theft. That's a serious accusation, my father said stiffly. It's not an accusation. It's a fact supported by evidence we've already gathered. I nodded toward Adam, who had continued filming the entire exchange. Evidence that will be presented in court if necessary. Julian stepped forward, his face dark with anger. You wouldn't dare drag the family name through a public lawsuit. You care about Devereux too much. You're right about one thing. I do care about Devereux, which is precisely why I won't let you destroy it. I met his gaze steadily. And if you think I won't go public to save what grandmother built, you've seriously misjudged me. A heavy silence fell over the room. My mother sank into a chair, looking suddenly exhausted. My father rubbed his forehead, the gesture of a man realizing he's miscalculated badly. Only Julian remained defiant, though I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "What happens now?" my father finally asked. I checked my watch. In exactly 15 minutes, Elena Martinez of Martinez and Wolcott will arrive with the full legal team. We'll be presenting terms for resolution that will allow Devereux to continue operating without public scandal. I looked at each of them, in turn. I suggest you use these 15 minutes to decide whether you want to fight a losing battle or reach a reasonable settlement. Settlement? Julian scoffed. You can't seriously think, Julian. My father's sharp tone cut him off. Enough. He turned to me. What are your terms? I'll discuss those with all parties present, including legal counsel, I replied. But I can tell you now that they include immediate cessation of all planning related to the Westland deal, full restoration of my position and authority regarding viticultural operations, and acknowledgement of my ownership of the Legacy Vineyard section and its cultivars. That's outrageous, Julian sputtered. After you abandoned us for a year. I didn't abandon anything, I said sharply. I went to enhance my expertise with every intention of returning. You took advantage of my absence to orchestrate a takeover, and now you're facing the consequences. My mother finally spoke, her voice small. We thought you'd moved on, Sophia. Your father said you had other opportunities in Europe, that you weren't coming back. I turned to her, feeling a twinge of what might have been pity. Did you ever try to confirm that with me directly? Did you ever call and ask about my plans? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The answer was clear. The sound of tires on. Gravel announced Elena's arrival. Adam moved to the window, nodding in confirmation. They're here, he said quietly. One last chance, I said, looking between my father and Julian. We can resolve this professionally, or we can let the courts decide, with all the public scrutiny that entails. My father straightened his shoulders, a shadow of his former authoritative self. We'll hear your terms. Julian opened his mouth to object, but my father silenced him with a raised hand. Enough, Julian. We'll hear her out. Minutes later, Elena and her team entered the room, bringing with them an air of brisk professionalism that transformed the family confrontation into a formal negotiation. Additional chairs were brought in. Documents were arranged on the table. Business cards were exchanged with cool courtesy. Elena wasted no time on pleasantries. As you're now aware, we have substantial evidence of legal improprieties in the management. Transition at Devereux Estates. Ms. Devereux has authorized me to present terms for resolution that would avoid the necessity of public litigation. She slid copies of a document across the table to my family and their hastily called attorney, who had arrived looking rumpled and unprepared. The key provisions are straightforward, Elena continued. First, immediate recognition of Sophia Devereux's ownership of the Legacy Vineyard section and all proprietary cultivars registered under her name. Second, restoration of her position as head vintner with full authority over viticultural decisions. Third, restructuring of the operational management to create clear separation of responsibilities. Sophia managing wine production and vineyard operations, Julian handling sales, marketing, and hospitality ventures, on the main property only, not the legacy section. My father skimmed the document, frowning. And the trust assets? The main estate? Ms. Devereux is not seeking to remove control of the main estate from the family trust, nor is she challenging your position as trustee, Elena replied. She is, however, requiring transparent governance, regular financial reporting, and a reversion to the original trustee voting requirements for any major decisions. including any potential partnerships or sales to outside entities. Julian leaned toward his father, whispering urgently. My father shook his head slightly, still reading the terms. You should know, Elena added, that we are prepared to file for an expanded injunction this afternoon if these terms are not accepted. That filing would include evidence of the forged documents and financial mismanagement, which would become public record. My family's attorney, Mr. Greeley, cleared his throat. My clients need time to review these terms properly and consider their options. Of course, Elena nodded. We'll give you 1 hour. After that, we proceed with the injunction filing. As Elena's team gathered their materials for a temporary withdrawal, I caught my brother's eye across the table. His expression was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and, just visible beneath those, fear. For the first time, perhaps, he was realizing that charm and manipulation wouldn't resolve this situation. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I stood, preparing to leave the room with Elena, when my father's voice stopped me. Sophia. He looked suddenly older, the weight of his miscalculations evident in the slump of his shoulders. Was there ever a point where this could have gone differently? I considered the question seriously. Yes, I said finally. You could have called me directly instead of believing whatever Julian told you. You could have honored grandmother's wishes. You could have remembered that Devereux was built for all of us, not just one favored son. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving my family to confront the choice before them. Accept my terms and salvage what remained of Devereux's future, or fight a battle they had already lost the moment my grandmother placed that box in a Swiss bank vault years ago? As we stepped onto the porch, Elena touched my arm lightly. They'll accept the terms, she said quietly. They have no choice. I nodded, gazing out over the morning-misted vineyards that stretched across the valley. Beyond the main plantings, just visible on a gentle rise, stood the stone wall that marked the boundary of my legacy section. The ancient vines within that enclosure had survived drought, disease, prohibition, and nearly a century of California seasons. Now they would survive this too. I know, I replied. And so do they. The hour we gave my family to consider the terms stretched into 2. Elena and I waited in the tasting room, which had been renovated in Julian's flashy style, all chrome and glass and abstract art that had nothing to do with winemaking or the family's heritage. Gone were the historical photographs of the early Q vineyard days, the framed first label my grandmother had designed by hand, the rustic wooden tasting counter that had welcomed visitors for decades. In their place stood a sleek bar topped with black marble, backlit shelves showcasing bottles with Julian's redesigned labels, and uncomfortable-looking modern stools. He's gutted the soul of the place, I murmured, running my fingers along the cold marble. That works in our favor, Elena replied pragmatically. If they've invested heavily in renovations while sales are declining, they're in an even more precarious financial position than the numbers suggest. Linda slipped into the tasting room, glancing nervously over her shoulder. They're still in the office with that attorney, she whispered. Julian is furious, but your father seems resigned. I've never seen him so deflated. A complicated emotion twisted in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite pity. And my mother? She left about 20 minutes ago. Went out to the Legacy Vineyard section. She's just standing there by the stone wall, staring at the vines. I thanked Linda and stepped outside, following the familiar path that wound through the main estate toward the small hill where the legacy vines grew. The day had warmed, burning off the morning mist to reveal a crystalline blue sky. The main vineyard looked immaculate as always, the perfect rows of vines stretching toward the horizon in military precision. But as I approached the stone wall, I could see that the legacy section had been neglected. Weeds sprouting between rows, unpruned growth sprawling where it should have been carefully trained. My mother stood with her back to me, one hand resting on the ancient stone wall that my great-grandfather had built a century ago. She didn't turn as I approached, though she must have heard my footsteps. "I knew you'd come here eventually," she said quietly. "You always loved this section best." I stopped beside her, looking out over the gnarled old vines. "What happened, Mom? How did we get to this point?" She sighed, still not meeting my eyes. "It was gradual, then sudden. When you left for France, Julian started spending more time with your father, suggesting small changes that seemed reasonable at first. A new label design, updated equipment, a more aggressive marketing strategy." She shook her head. "Before I realized what was happening, he had convinced your father that the entire business needed modernization. And erasing me from the company history? Was that part of modernization too?" Her shoulders slumped. Julian framed it as a streamlining of the narrative. He kept saying that having too many decision-makers complicated the brand identity, that customers respond better to a single visionary leader. She finally turned to face me. "I should have questioned it more. I should have called you directly. But Julian, he can be very persuasive when he wants something." "That's not an excuse," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "You knew what grandmother wanted. You knew how hard I'd worked for this place." "I did." Her admission was barely audible. "But your father was so excited about Julian finally taking an interest in the business. After years of chasing him to be more involved, suddenly he was passionate, engaged, full of ideas. It seemed like a miracle." She gestured vaguely toward the main house. "By the time I realized his vision was erasing everything that made Devereux special, the changes were already happening, and your father wouldn't hear any criticism." We stood in silence, the breeze rustling through the ancient vines. In that moment, I saw my mother clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not as the confident family matriarch I'd always perceived, but as someone who had chosen the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict even at the cost of betraying her own daughter. "The vines need attention," I said finally, kneeling to examine the base of a particularly neglected plant. "Another season of this level of neglect, and we could lose some of the older stock. Can they be saved?" There was genuine concern in her voice. "Yes. They're resilient. Much more than Julian gives them credit for. They just need proper care." I stood, brushing dirt from my hands. "I'll start tomorrow." She looked surprised. "Then you're staying? Even after everything?" "This is my legacy, Mom. I'm not abandoning it because the family dynamics got complicated." I gazed out over the vineyard. "Grandmother taught me that you don't walk away from vines just because the season gets difficult. You protect them, nurture them through the hard times, and trust that they'll produce again when conditions improve." My mother's eyes welled with tears. "Your grandmother would be proud of you. She always said you had her spirit." "I know." I allowed myself a small smile. She made sure I had her contingency planning too. Back at the main house, we found Elena emerging from the office, a satisfied expression on her face. She nodded subtly as our eyes met. They had accepted the terms. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but resigned. Julian sat rigidly in a chair, by the window, refusing to look at me. My father stood as I entered, his expression a complex mixture of chagrin and relief. "The paperwork is being drafted now," he said without preamble. "Your attorney has been thorough in ensuring the terms. Protect your interests," I nodded. "And Westland?" "I've already called their representative to cancel our preliminary discussions." He hesitated. "I should have consulted you before entertaining that option. I see that now." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. For now, that would have to be enough. "We need to discuss transition plans," I said, taking a seat at the conference table. "The harvest is approaching, and there's significant work to be done in the legacy vineyard section to prepare the vines." Julian made a dismissive sound. Those old vines won't produce enough to justify the effort. We should focus resources on the main vineyard where yields are predictable. That's exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that's damaged our reputation, I replied evenly. The legacy vines produce our most distinctive grapes precisely because they're old and low yield. Quality over quantity is what built the Devereux name. Quality doesn't pay bills, Julian snapped. Actually, it does. I opened my laptop, pulling up a spreadsheet. I've analyzed our sales data from the past 5 years. The limited edition Eloise Reserve, produced exclusively from legacy vineyard grapes, generated more profit per acre than any other wine in our portfolio, by a factor of 3. What it lacked in volume, it more than made up for in price point and prestige. My father leaned forward, examining the figures. Is this accurate? Completely. I pulled the data directly from our sales records this morning. I turned the screen so he could see more clearly. The legacy vines aren't just historically significant, they're economically valuable when properly leveraged. Julian looked away, but not before I caught the flash of surprise in his eyes. He'd never bothered to run the numbers, too focused on his vision of modernization to consider that traditional methods might actually be more profitable. Starting tomorrow, I'll need a crew dedicated to rehabilitating the legacy section, I continued, shifting into operational mode. We have 8 weeks until harvest, which gives us just enough time to get those vines back into proper condition if we work quickly. I can arrange that, my father nodded, falling into the familiar rhythm of vineyard planning. For a moment, it felt almost normal, the 3 of us discussing harvest preparations, just as we had for years before everything fractured. But the illusion of normalcy shattered when Julian suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. You can't just walk back in here and start giving orders after abandoning the business for a year. I didn't abandon anything, I said calmly. I went to study advanced techniques with every intention of bringing that knowledge back to improve our wines. You're the one who saw an opportunity in my absence and exploited it. I saw a business that needed direction, he shot back. A business stuck in outdated traditions instead of evolving with the market. And how has that evolution worked out? Sales down 30%, longtime distributors canceling contracts, expenses skyrocketing with nothing to show for it. I closed my laptop. The market didn't want Devereux to become a generic luxury brand. They valued our authenticity and heritage. Julian looked to our father for support, but found none. The numbers didn't lie, and my father had always respected data over rhetoric. The terms of the agreement are clear, my father said with finality. Sophia will oversee wine production and vineyard operations. Julian, you'll continue managing sales, marketing, and hospitality, with the stipulation that major branding or positioning changes require joint approval. It wasn't a perfect solution. The fractures in our family wouldn't heal overnight, if ever. But it was a framework that would allow Devereux to survive and potentially thrive again. The following morning, I arrived at the estate just after dawn, dressed in work clothes and boots. I'd spent the night at a hotel in town, not yet ready to move back into the family home. That would come later, perhaps, when the wounds weren't quite so fresh. Linda met me at the equipment shed, accompanied by several longtime vineyard workers, who greeted me with warm handshakes and relieved smiles. They had known me since childhood, had taught me to drive the tractor, to identify pests and diseases, to feel the soil and understand its needs. They had watched me grow from a curious child to a knowledgeable vintner, and they had witnessed my sudden erasure from the business with silent disapproval. "We're ready when you are, Ms. Sophia," said Miguel, our most experienced field manager. "We've prepared the tools for the legacy section rehabilitation." I nodded gratefully. "Thank you for staying through all the changes." Miguel shrugged, a gesture eloquent in its simplicity. "We belong to the land, not to whoever sits in the office. The vines know who understands them." Together, we walked up to the legacy section. In the clear morning light, I could see exactly what needed to be done. Selective pruning to remove damaged growth while preserving the ancient structure of the vines. Careful weeding to eliminate competition without disturbing the shallow root. Systems, minor trellis repairs to support branches heavy with developing fruit. As I knelt beside the first vine, pruning shears in hand, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. This was where I belonged, doing the work I understood in my bones. I made the first cut with surgical precision, removing a dead branch to allow energy to flow to healthier growth. Miguel nodded approvingly. Just like your grandmother taught you. She'd be furious about the condition of these vines, I said, continuing to work. She'd be proud of you for fighting for them, he countered. By mid-morning, we had made visible progress on the first row. News of my return had spread quickly through the estate, and occasionally I caught glimpses of staff members walking past the stone wall, some offering waves or thumbs-up signals of support. Around 11, a catering van from town appeared, delivering lunch for the entire crew, arranged by Linda without my knowledge, a small gesture of welcome. As we broke for lunch, I noticed my father standing at the edge of the legacy section, watching our work with an unreadable expression. After a moment's hesitation, I walked over to him. We should be able to rehabilitate most of the vines before harvest, I said, gesturing to the progress we'd already made. It will be a reduced yield this year, but by next season, they should be back to full production capacity. He nodded, eyes scanning the ancient plants with newfound respect. I never fully understood this section the way you and your grandmother did. Julian convinced me they were more valuable as real estate than as productive vines. Julian sees the world in terms of immediate return on investment, I replied. These vines are a long-term asset. Their value isn't just in this year's harvest, but in the distinctiveness they bring to our entire brand identity. My father was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I made a mistake, Sophia. Several mistakes, actually. Coming from him, it was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. Yes, you did, I agreed, neither absolving nor condemning. The question is where we go from here. Forward, I suppose. He gestured toward the work in progress. These vines have survived worse than family disagreements over the years. If they can adapt and thrive after a period of neglect, perhaps we can too. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too recent. But it was an acknowledgement that something valuable remained worth salvaging, in the vineyard, in the business, and perhaps, someday, in our family. That evening, after the work crews had departed, I sat alone on the stone wall surrounding the legacy vineyard, watching the sunset paint the vines in gold and amber light. In my hand, I held a small notebook I'd found tucked beneath a loose stone, my grandmother's private vineyard journal, where she'd recorded observations about these specific vines for decades. The final entry, dated just weeks before her death, read simply, Sophia understands what these vines need. Trust her to protect them when I no longer can. I closed the journal, pressing it against my heart. I will, grandmother, I whispered to the twilight air. I promise. The legacy vines stood silent and enduring around me, their ancient roots, holding firm to the soil despite seasons of neglect. Like them, I had weathered an attempt to uproot me from where I belonged. And like them, I would not only survive but thrive again, producing something distinctive and valuable that couldn't be replicated or replaced. The reclamation had begun, of the vines, of my role at Devereux, and of the legacy my grandmother had entrusted to me. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but as I looked out over the vineyard glowing in the last light of day, I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.